This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers, scholars and other people who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. I'm now joined here by Professor Carole Fink. She's a historian at Ohio State University, who is in Tel Aviv now this week for a conference in which she gave a talk titled The Jews and International Minority Protection, 1919 to 1939. Hello, Professor Fink, and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Just to start by way of introduction, can you describe the situation of minority protection provisions in the immediate aftermath of the First World War?
Yes. Well, after World War I, it was generally assumed that there would be a whole belt of new states formed in Eastern Europe between defeated Germany and Soviet Russia, that this was going to be a zone of some conflict among the new states, that none of these new states would be homogeneous, either nationally or religiously. And a clamor came up, both from the Jews, but also from international humanitarian organizations, and of course from the German government, which was going to be the motherland of some 8 million unwilling new subjects in these new states of Eastern Europe. The people at the Paris Peace Conference had decided that all efforts in the past to protect minority rights
in 1919,
before the First World War, there had been some desultory efforts in the Ottoman Empire, in the new states in the Balkans, to grant a certain kind of protection. None of these efforts had been at all successful. States like Romania, for example, refused to enfranchise its Jewish population and kept them as subjects and not citizens. So after the First World War, the ground was laid not only for creating new states like Poland and Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, but also to put some provision into the peace treaties so that these new states would be restrained from persecuting these people, that Germany and Soviet Russia would be restrained from interfering in their neighbors, and that the minorities would be granted sufficient protection so that they wouldn't make a ruckus, and things would somehow, they hoped, settle down.
And to what extent did Jewish diplomats play a part in this state of affairs?
They were quite prominent. They descended on Paris from about 12 different countries, east and west. Most prominent, of course, were the representatives from the United States and Great Britain, but also a large contingent of East European Jews came to Paris. And there the problem began, because West European and American Jews had a certain conception of minority rights that adhered to the Western, limited, liberal idea that everybody should have civil liberties and equality before the law, and that's it. East European Jews, on the other hand, knowing full well that they were not going to assimilate into these new states, wanted fairly extensive national, cultural, and other kinds of rights. They wanted to be represented as a people in these new countries.
Did they come to the conference as representative of the Jewish people, of Jewish communities, or of the?
This was quite different. This was quite different because the American and the American and British representatives were part of what they used to call the princes. These were the elite organizations. Although the American delegate, Louis Marshall, also represented the American Jewish Congress, which was unprecedented and populist. But really, he was part of the American Jewish Committee and the Uptown Jews, and what they wanted was something very close to the way they perceived the way minorities should behave.
So that by these diplomats and by the powers at the time, the Jews were seen as any other just as any other minority in Europe?
The problem was that the ones coming from Eastern Europe, who formed something called the Committee of Jewish Delegations. There were elections all over Eastern Europe, and they came, as I said, with very extensive expectations of recognition. Now, the peacemakers, France, Britain, and the United States, who basically wrote the peace, one knew very little about Eastern Europe, but two were quite worried about what was going to happen there. And three, what they didn't want was what they said to create states within a state. And four, they didn't want to exaggerate the minority question because, as we well know, they too had minorities. I mean, the United States had a very serious minority problem. Britain had a multinational empire. Even the French, who were about to take back Alsace and Lorraine, France was not really a completely homogeneous country. So what they devised at Paris was a very special regime just for Eastern Europe. That is, they didn't call for universal minority rights, that all minorities should have X, Y, and Z. What they said was that in Eastern Europe, we will establish a regime, perhaps transitory, in which the people living in these states will have a certain number of rights: the right to vote, the right to become citizens.
But was it evident to everybody that the Jews would be a minority enjoying this, just like, or was it not contentious or controversial at all?
No, in fact, in the months during and after World War I, there were pogroms all over Eastern Europe. As these new states were trying to grab as much land as possible, there was violence against these Jews in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, in Ukraine after the war. And so the need for protection was absolutely there. There were going to be some 3 million Jews in Poland. There were going to be 500,000 Jews in Czechoslovakia. There were going to be large numbers in an expanded Romania. And it was very obvious that these people would need some kind of protection. The innovation is that it was going to be international. That is, it wasn't going to be up to their governments to grant them these freedoms, these constitutional rights. There was going to be a new League of Nations that would be responsible for enforcement. This is the innovation of the period after the First World War.
And during that period, of course, when it comes to the Jews, obviously, there was this big elephant in the room, Zionism. What was their reaction to it? What role did Zionism play in all this? Because the exercise that they were involved in was the polar opposite of what Zionism tried to promote.
Extremely important. Zionism, the whole question of Palestine, actually comes up first at the peace conference. It is aired before the peace conference. The Zionists make their case. They hope to be inserted in the peace treaty. And what happens? Woodrow Wilson says, wait a minute, we're not ready to make a decision on this. And so the whole Zionist project is delayed, and it is seriously delayed. Wilson dispatches a commission to go to the Middle East to check what the local people want in terms of their self-determination and their rulership. Now, the protagonists of minority rights, that is, those millions of Jews who would be left in Eastern Europe, who would, after all, not be able, all of them, or even want to go to Palestine, they were now left with a project that, one, had no state supporting them. They were divided among themselves. Some of them were Zionists, some of them were not Zionists. They were divided west and east, with their American and British counterparts calling for one thing, and the East European Jews calling for something else. And what they did is, as these pogroms were raging in Eastern Europe, they scrambled to come up with a program. And at the very, very last minute, something is handed to Woodrow Wilson, at which point the Americans said, no, this is too much. The new East European states said, no, we will not accept this. What we will accept is minority rights for everybody. But what we will not accept is a regime that prejudices and humiliates us and reduces our power. At which point Woodrow Wilson says to them, in a very, very incorrect way, but we liberated you, and we therefore have the right to impose conditions on your recognition. And this is precisely what happens. But the equivocal thing, I mean, the Jews celebrated this because they did get minority treaties after World War I. But in a way it was...
Even the hardline Zionists among them.
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Because, having minority rights was not absolutely antithetical. I mean, the hope was, of course, that many of these people would go to Palestine, but in the meantime, the millions. I mean, after all, Palestine was a very poor place, and the idea, and Weizmann himself was not looking for every poor Jew in Eastern Europe to pick himself up and go to Palestine. They were looking for a certain kind of settler. So what will happen to these large numbers of diverse communities in Eastern Europe? And so the Zionists, were perfectly happy with protection. But the question is what level of protection they actually walked off with. And the Americans came home and said, we have a new Bill of Rights. But in fact, the League of Nations, which is supposed to take over this form of protection, and this is unprecedented again, for a new international organization to look after millions of people who are now living, many of them involuntarily, under an alien rule. You're a Jew living in Poland, you're a German living in Czechoslovakia, you're a Hungarian living in Romania, and not all that happy about it. And so what the League did was to set up a system that was seemingly permissive, that the minorities could send petitions and complain about violations. But what the League did with these petitions was mostly to dispose of them. And it was only in 1926 when Germany finally joins the League and fashions itself a minorities defender that the whole minority issue becomes hot.
And tell us a bit about the German case.
Well, the German case, I've written, the German case is poignant because we must remember that before 1933, the German Republic was considered the defender of minorities, the defender of minority rights, because they had all of these kin people spread out all over Eastern Europe and in danger of losing their land and losing their citizenship. And there was, in fact, in the 1920s, a very close alliance between Germans and Jews. They collaborated at international congresses. The Germans stood up for the rights of the Jewish minorities, and the Jews.
The Germans, you mean the German government or German minorities in Eastern Europe?
Jewish minority groups in Eastern Europe got subsidies from the German government because the minority cause was something that a defeated Germany could use to accuse the peacemakers of saying, you didn't keep your promises. We have people in Eastern Europe who are losing their land, who are in danger of losing their citizenship. They're being persecuted by these new and nationalist rulers. And of course, the German case was very much the same as the Jewish case, that these are not liberal governments. Even Czechoslovakia, which we often have considered the paragon, if you will, of liberalism. Well, it really wasn't. It really wasn't. And for instance, when the Jews asked Thomas Masaryk for national rights, he said no.
National as in collective rights?
Collective
for the
rights?
Jews.
No. And they had a very interesting census in Czechoslovakia where they basically forced the Jews to sign up as Jews so they wouldn't sign up as Germans. So that they would, because most Jews in Czechoslovakia were German speaking. Yeah. And so the Jews got caught in the middle of this ferocious German-Czech rivalry in Czechoslovakia.
And all in all, in this whole scheme of things, it seems that it was a very flawed system in the first place. But then, even if it, functioned for a bit, it didn't hold water for very long. Well,
the problem, of course, was that these new states that are formed, Romania, for example, which was tripled in size after World War I. The Romanian government saw itself as the homeland of the Romanian people. And all the others, the Germans, the Hungarians, the Jews, and everybody else were subordinate.
Sounds vaguely familiar for Israel today.
Exactly. But here's the difference. The Germans and Jews collaborated in Romania. They worked together. There was a kind of transnational movement. I mean, this, in a sense, is the beginning of the whole sort of human rights thing. That if the state becomes a tormentor, then you work together. And what you do is either you work locally or you work nationally, if you can, or you try to get an international outside intercessor. Every now and then American Jews, even though America wasn't in the League, but it did try. Louis Marshall, for instance, did try to put a little pressure on Poland He made trips to Geneva. Lucien Wolfe would make trips to the various East European capitals and try to convince them that it would be good for these governments not to torment their Jews.
Just the Jews, not the minorities in general?
That's one of the weaknesses. That's one of the weaknesses that you don't get on a national or international level substantial cooperation. And two, with the Jews were very ambivalent about a universal minority regime because an American Jew or a British Jew would not want to say to their government, I think everybody should have minority rights. They kept a very low profile during this period. It would have been too challenging to the governments that they served and loved. And that's one of the great weaknesses of the regime, especially in 1933. I mean, Germany was not bound by a minority treaty, except in the tiny province of Upper Silesia. And when Hitler...
Which is close to Poland, right?
It was divided between Germany and Poland, and they set up a 15-year transition regime. And there, the Jews were protected, at least until 1937.
But what did this protection mean in practical terms?
They could go to the League and complain. And there was a very high-profile case in May of 1933, where a Jew named Franz Bernheim actually sent a petition to the League and said, I've been thrown out of my job because I'm a Jew. And the League accepted this case. And it was broadcast. It was actually heard, the deliberations were heard in New York. And the League voted in favor of this Jewish person, and the Nazi government had, between 33 and 37, to protect Jewish rights in Upper Silesia. Not anywhere.
We're talking about the Nazi regime. It seems that, when it comes to, any kind of peaceful overtures and protection of minorities, the Nazis had a terrible track record. How did the coming of Hitler to power change things internationally?
Overnight. Well, what happened was the Nazi government announces that Germandom needs to be protected all over Eastern Europe. But the problem inside Germany is that German Jews don't recognize themselves as a minority. They think they're German. And what we want to do, and they use this word, we want them to disassimilate. We want them to be Jews. And so overnight, German Jews who had assimilated, who thought of themselves as German, who had, not functioned as Jews, suddenly become not only marginalized, they, slowly they lose their rights, they lose their jobs, they lose their citizenship. And the whole project is, of course, to make them leave. To make them leave. In other words, the Nazis create of German Jews a minority. And they do the same thing when they seize Austria.
Of course, but not a protected one. So what does the League does in return?
Upper Silesia until 1937 is what was called a reserve. It's a very special place. After 37, Silesian Jews fall into the...
How many Jews were there in Upper Silesia?
Not very many. Less than 100,000. It's a very, it's a very tiny enclave. But the reason that they observed it for Upper Silesia was because of the Germans in Poland. That they wanted those Germans protected, and this way, and this is part of the whole human rights diplomacy. This is.
But that is also some sort of there's some sort of historical irony in it because the protection of German minorities was one of the pretexts of the Nazis to invade Eastern Europe.
That's absolutely right. It was a pretext. Of course, it was a pretext. But Hitler fancied himself and posed himself as the protector of the Germans in the Saar, in Austria, in the Sudetenland. Later on in Memel, and finally in Danzig, which is where the Allies finally said enough. That this is not simply a project of protecting your endangered kin people.
Was his expansionist policy, aggressive policy?
Yeah.
Did it draw on the treaties of
He drew on the rights rhetoric. Absolutely, the Germans of Czechoslovakia are being persecuted, and
how did the League react to that?
Well, it's very interesting. Of course, they wanted Germany to come back to the League. Germany exited in October of 1933, so people were very, very scared, of antagonizing Nazi Germany. There was also a certain amount of guilt over the peace treaties. By the 1930s, people began to feel that maybe the peace treaties weren't all that fair. Maybe creating a state like Czechoslovakia and adding 3 million Germans, which to create the Polish corridor and take Danzig away from Germany, or to take Memel away from Germany and make it the port of Lithuania. Now, some of this, of course, is just, rationalization, because they were scared of the Germans. They were scared of the Germans. But there was also a feeling that maybe the peace treaty was not a good idea.
Yeah.
And maybe minority protection was something beyond their capacity. Simply beyond their capacity. There's a very high-profile case, just as World War II is about to break out, where Romania decides it's going to disenfranchise most of its Jews. And again, the World Jewish Congress brings a case to the League of Nations, and the League is not able to handle this.
Yeah.
It's not able to, because, Romania is there saying, we can do whatever we want with our population. This is not your business. At which point, the Jewish representatives go to Paris, London, and Washington. And they get these three powers to put a little pressure on the Bucharest government, but not enough to make them stop. By the time World War II breaks out, masses of Romanian Jews have lost their citizenship, which, as you well know, if you don't have citizenship, you're in considerable danger. You can't cross borders and be accepted anywhere else.
Yeah. And the rest, as they say, is history. We all know what happened to minorities, especially the Jewish ones, during the Second World War.
It has an afterlife, because after World War II, the United Nations, it's very ironic, they say, well, are the treaties still in force? Do we have to take them again? The East European states, who are all in exile in London, say, absolutely not. We will not sign them again. We will not accept it. The Jews are divided. Of course, most of the Jews have been murdered, but there are some. And the question was, should this regime return to Eastern Europe? And instead what happens is the whole question of minority rights does in the end get swallowed up into the larger issue of human rights. Because of the resistance, also because Britain, the United States, the Soviet Union was absolutely against any form of minority rights.
Yeah, sure.
And because of Hitler, which you have brought up, because of Hitler's abuse of the idea of minority rights, somebody finally says, gee, we have to protect ourselves from minorities and from this terribly disruptive project.
And also they saw the world through the class lens, so they weren't really bothered with minorities, right?
Right.
With nationality in general.
And the last thing was that, before World War I, and then again in 1922, the most radical solution to minority problems before the Holocaust was expulsion and what we called population exchange. 10 million Germans were thrown out of Eastern Europe after World War II. I mean, the sense was there are no minorities left in Eastern Europe, and the communists put up a big show that there were no minorities, but gee, they all seem to reappear.
Yeah.
But in 1945, the sense was it's not a problem anymore.
Right.
What we really have to deal with is the aftermath of the Holocaust and making sure that in a larger sense, the state does not abuse its citizens, and not just minority citizens, but also, all citizens.
Yeah, perhaps they were seeking to refine the concept of citizenship.
To refine it, absolutely. Absolutely, and to broaden it, and to broaden it in different kinds of ways.
Professor Carole Fink, I'm afraid we've run out of time, so thank you very much for this. You're a historian at Ohio State University in the United States, specializing in international European history. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you.
That brings us to the end of our show. Thank you very much for listening. I'm Gilad Halpern, signing off now here in Tel Aviv. I'd like to thank our technical producers, Alex Benish and Adam Scher. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, do not forget to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. And of course, get in touch with your comments and suggestions. And until then, goodbye.